He changed church practice, and his influence has impacted generations. We're going to answer the question of who was Donald McGavran on this episode, and why was he important? All right, Dad. I know that this is a person that is near and dear to your heart. The
He
the
is.
the
He is.
late
I
the late
love Donald
great.
McGavran, and I want you to love him too. You don't know where that
The
line comes from, do you?
No, I don't. I recognize it, but I don't know where it comes from.
It's Gail Sayers talking about Brian Piccolo and Brian's song. The you don't remember?
Oh yeah. Okay,
He
I
dies.
recognize.
The
Well,
running back
and
Gales.
Donald McGavran has died too.
Yeah, and I will soon. So we're all it's close.
I don't want to think about that just yet, but all right. So on this
All right.
episode, we are, and we may do this in future episodes. Just ask the question, "Who was?" and do a quick overview of an important person. And I'll just say an important person, probably globally, but certainly with American church practice. Who was Donald McGavran, Dad?
Donald McGavran is the most famous and most positive contribution to church life in America that no one knows. How about
Yes,
that?
I agree.
I
I
mean,
agree.
you ask almost anyone, leaders in church health, leaders in churches, you ask publishers, hey, who is Donald McGavran? Who? And yet he may be no, he is one of the most influential people in church life in America today. And by the way, I know you're going to ask me other questions, but I do believe it's more America than globally, and I'll tell why in a minute.
Yes, well, he did start on the mission field. A lot of his ideas started on the mission field, but we'll get to that
Right.
here in a moment.
Right.
All right, now that we know he is influential, who was he?
Donald McGavran was a missionary to India, and he looked out at the mission field and he said, "You know what? We're not seeing many people come to Christ. We need to do something differently." And that sounds like a duh comment, but it became radically transformational. And he started asking the question, what can we do with God's resources to reach more people with the gospel? And the mission field in India changed as a result. He eventually came to the United States. Fuller Seminary, under the Fuller Institute of Church Growth, asked him to come and be dean of their School of Missions and Church Growth. And they said, take these principles and apply them to American church life. Donald McGavran's response was, and I summarize, well, why should I have to do that? Because everybody knows that these are basic obedient principles to reaching people with the gospel. But it wasn't happening in America, still not to a large degree. But his influence, let me just give you one example. If you ask Rick Warren, who is one of the most influential people in his life, he would say Donald McGavran. He didn't, to my knowledge, Rick did not meet Donald McGavran, but he learned about Donald McGavran through Roy Fish at Southwestern Seminary. And what Donald McGavran did moved Rick in a direction that where he became concerned about reaching people who didn't know Christ. So Donald McGavran established principles, wrote books, and when he had the institutional leadership and headquarters at Fuller Seminary, he became the founder of what is known as the church growth movement. Usually we assign his book, Riches of God, published in 1955, as the birth certificate of the church growth movement. And since it is my birth year as well, I like both of them. Rock and roll was born in 1955. Buddy Holly, Donald McGavran was born in 55. I mean, started the movement in 55. And Tom Rainer was born in 55. Trifecta!
Well, why? Okay, and you kind of skipped past the second question. Um, you probably see it in the notes, so I didn't even have to ask it. But why was his influence important? Why are we still talking about Donald McGavran today? Why are we doing this?
Well, Sam, here's what you need to know, and I want our listeners and viewers to know this as well. Donald McGavran took took the American church world, let's say, that was on a path of either no growth or at best transfer growth, and through his influence started pointing us to conversion growth. That is simply the most important thing. In fact, My favorite book that he ever wrote was not his Bridges of God or Understanding Church Growth, the ones that are usually assigned to him. It was the book called Effective Evangelism. And he said, "This is what I've been trying to say. If we're not doing evangelism, let's close the church down." His influence, many people say, oh, he influenced the mega churches to become as big as they are, or he influenced the seeker movement. He had nothing to do with that, Sam. His influence was on conversion growth. Now, all the other forms of growth that I just mentioned and others, yeah, they took off in different directions, but he was concerned about conversion growth.
So how are churches still using his contributions today?
They're not, to a large degree. Now you
Now,
say, well,
explain that because I don't know that I would fully agree with you there.
and the reason that you would not fully agree, if I can read your mind, which last time I checked, I did not have that spiritual gift, you would say he has helped churches to understand how important context is in reaching people, which is
Yes.
definitely one of his contributions. But as a matter of fact, you look at our most popular resource, our fastest selling resource is called Know Your Community. All right, so that resource is basically McGavran influence. All demographic and psychographic studies have McGavran influence. So context was huge for McGavran. It helped churches to understand we're not isolated. We live in a community. We live in a neighborhood, and so it is important to know context. But when I said they're not, to which you immediately said I might disagree with you, what I was saying is his primary concern was reaching people with the gospel. Context was important because you knew who was there to be reached. Okay, now you can counter in any way you want to.
Yeah, no, I just think a lot of modern day missiology is influenced by McGavran. I don't think we get the missions movement that we had, the contextual
Fair,
movement without
fair enough.
Donald McGavran.
Fair enough.
There is no Ed Stetzer without Donald McGavran.
There is no Tom Rainer without Donald McGavran.
I just threw his name out there because you guys have
'Cause,
such a love hate relationship.
oh, Ed and I are fine. So you start looking at Donald McGavran and Tom Rainer. By the way, I only spoke to him once, so it's not like we were buddy buddies. I ended up doing my dissertation on his mentee, C. Peter Wagner, before Wagner went off into these different types of directions. I did my dissertation on him, but obviously you cannot understand Peter Wagner. I shouldn't say obviously. Peter Wagner, the late Peter Wagner would say, "You can
I
understand
knew that
me,
was
can't
coming.
you?"
I knew that was coming. It's been
Well,
coming the
let's
entire
don't
episode.
edit it. Let's have boogers flowing on this podcast. So, so
I've been biting my tongue. I've been biting my tongue this whole time. I'm so glad you're the one who's supposed to be talking.
I think it's perfect. I think it's perfect. So I did my dissertation on C. Peter Wagner, my PhD dissertation, and I could not understand Wagner without fully understanding McGavran, because McGavran's a first generation church growth person, Wagner's second, and they say I'm third. But I am more McGavran than I am Wagner, even though I did my dissertation on Wagner.
Yeah. I think you can connect the dots between McGavran's work, the church growth movement, the early church growth movement, the later church growth movement, because there really were kind of two parallel, two path, an earlier path and a later path with the church growth movement, and then the later path led to things like the mega church movement, which then you get the missional movement in response to a lot of what was happening in the seeker sensitive stuff. So I just think that there's a lot of connections there, and I don't think you have like the missional movement without McGavran. So I think that we're distanced from a lot of what McGavran did. I think we would be good to revisit a lot of his work. He did come up with this thing called the homogeneous unit principle, which has been controversial
Mhm.
and something that I have critiqued, at least in the way that it is practiced, not necessarily in the way that it explains, but in terms of making it prescriptive instead of descriptive. Where, well, you explain that. Why would the homogeneous unit principle be okay in terms of description instead of prescription?
Okay, you talk about the homogeneous unit principle, and you usually get people, if they know anything about it, riled up. Oh, we know what that means:
It
racist
doesn't.
segregation.
I'm guilty.
Okay, but let me ask. Let's ask the listeners and viewers this question: if we weren't having this conversation about HUP, homogeneous unit principle, and I said this, we don't need to put up artificial barriers in order for people to come to know Christ. Would you agree?
Yes.
That's the homogeneous unit principle. That
Yeah,
is,
but the homogeneous unit principle also says that people are more likely to come to Christ around people who are like them,
yep, and
which
because
which is true.
they don't have to cross a cultural, ethnic, or racial barrier. Exactly. But
And
then when it becomes prescripted, it becomes segregation.
right.
It becomes prejudicial. So it's a fine line that is there. McGavran didn't cross the line. Wagner did cross the line.
Yes, I would agree. And others, not just Wagner, but others in the church growth movement, particularly the later church growth movement, began to come up with things like uh, relocating urban churches into the suburbs because that's where the rich white people are.
Exactly.
And those were practices that I think were largely detrimental to the church, and things that were
I do not
perhaps
disagree, but
motivated
I
with
understand why they did it.
poor
And if
intentions. We
any of
can't
you
do.
are say, "Hey Sam," if anybody's viewing you, you just froze like an iceberg. So we'll get both your sneeze and your freeze, and those are the two of your disease
Oh
on
man,
this particular. Amy, did you see it? I'm looking at you. Did you see the freeze? Yeah, yeah, it's good. Okay, you got one more question, and we'll wrap it up.
is it going to have an impact in the future?
It should. It should. And the impact that I hope that it'll have is that we'll return to the Great Commission heart of reaching people with the gospel. And if we really have that desire, we will have to understand our context. One follows the other. Spoke at a convention last night, and I said, it's easy to tell you what you're missing right now. All of us, we're missing evangelism. And evangelism is not done in isolation. It is under, there's this tool we have I ever mentioned to you, know your community? Know your community. I think somebody came up with this phrase, you can't reach your community unless you know
No, your
your community.
community. Yeah, your
Exactly.
son. One of your sons came up with that one. You might
Yeah.
be on a show with him right now.
Yeah, or either Art, because we don't know where Art is. So that I think is critically important. And one of the reasons I love the fact that know your community is so well received is because now people are saying we really have to reach the community. So I think evangelism and understanding our context are the big future impact on the church.
You can also get a free 30-day trial for our silver membership. There's a link below to check that out. We'd love for you to join us and over 1,800 church leaders that contribute at Church Answers Central. It's a great place, safe place, private place to learn what's going on in the church. So check out the free link below. Like and subscribe. Like this video, subscribe, and visit us at churchanswers.com, where we are growing healthy churches together.